Josh Spector of I Want to Know podcast, as well as the For the Interested newsletter, which is where I initially heard of him and learned a ton about newsletters, talks to us about the difference between people that find him elsewhere and people that find him with his podcast, and what that means for conversions to his business, as well as the strategic way he made his podcast format to lead to high conversions. All right, so Josh, how has your podcast impacted your business?
It's funny. I've been doing it for a couple of years now, and it's interesting because podcasts, unlike newsletters, I have a big newsletter for theinterested.com, and with newsletters, it's very easy to sort of track immediately. Like you send a promotion for some offer or service, and you can see how many people clicked, and you sort of know immediately if it's working or not. And with podcasts, I found that a lot of times I find out after the fact. So I know it has helped in terms of people buying my services and hiring me, and I help people hire me to help them get more clients from their content. But what's interesting is a lot of times I don't know it until after they even purchase. And I go, oh, how did you hear about me? What led you to buy? And they're like, oh, I listen to your podcast all the time. And I don't have specific numbers on it, but I know that my buyers are way over indexing on listening to my podcast. Right. So like my newsletter is much bigger than my podcast. I do a couple of thousand downloads a month, something like that. My newsletter has about 30,000 subscribers, but I know that my buyers, the people that are buying from me, my customers, there's a high percentage of them that are listening to my podcast. And we'll get into sort of what my podcast is. It's called I Want to Know, and sort of how I do it. I think there's a reason for that. I've been kind of strategic in the format. But that is definitely, so, it's definitely grown. I don't think it's necessarily grown my audience, but I do think it's grown my business. I think that podcast is leading people to buy.
This is part of Podcast to Connect. We're in the middle of a season right now where we're following April from Dorky Podcast through a series of kind of like mini coaching sessions where we're working through her audience growth. The entire season is focused on audience growth for her history podcast. It's an entire season. We're at episode 2. It'll go to episode 8 by the end of the year. So please do join us for that. Okay, so it is attracting new listeners, but it sounds like it's also keeping your current clients in your business for any new products or services that you have as well.
For me, I think what it does. So first of all, my podcast is called I Want to Know. You can go to joshspector.com/podcast to learn about it and check it out. And the basic premise of the podcast is, as opposed to most shows where the host is interviewing other people, which is really a showcase for the guest's expertise, my business is all about people hiring me to help them. So I wanted to create a show that's a showcase for my expertise. So in most episodes of my show, a guest comes on, they ask me 3 questions about content strategy, and it's really like recording a coaching call, right? Yeah. And there's no sort of like that. It's very like no fluff, like we get right into it, and that's what it is. So I think as a result, and this was very intentional, and it has worked out and played out that way, people that are listening to my podcast are basically hearing me do coaching and consulting, right? So they're seeing, I think that's why it's led to more business for me, because they're seeing, oh, look at what this guy just said to X, Y, and Z person. It's funny because in most cases, especially in the sort of coaching and consulting world, you rarely get to actually see the person do coaching before you hire them. Yep. So creating a podcast that is basically a showcase for what they're going to get if they hire me has worked really well. And that's why I think it really over indexes, besides it being valuable and people find it helpful and all of that kind of stuff. It is very much aligned with what I ultimately sell.
Wait, when you say over indexed, what do you mean by that?
So for example, my newsletter, and I love newsletters, and it's the engine of everything that I do. But so I have about 33,000 newsletter subscribers. And let's say I have a couple thousand, again, podcast metrics are weird, but let's say, let's say my average episode gets, maybe a couple thousand downloads. Right? So my newsletter audience is way bigger than my podcast audience, right? And so my podcast audience, let's just to keep the math simple, whatever. Let's say I have, 2,000 podcast listeners and I have 30,000 subscribers.
Mm-hmm.
That's less than 10%,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Now, my customers, way more than 10% of my buyers say they
Mhm.
listen to my podcast. So that's what I mean that it's over indexing, right? Those people that are listening by percentage of my audience
Mhm.
are small. It's less than 10%.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But buyers, I don't know, but I would guess at least 50% of my buyers and my clients have listened to my podcast. And
Right.
so I think that is showing the power of the podcast
Mhm.
as a conversion tool,
Yeah.
as opposed to a sort of audience growth tool, which I think again, it
Mhm.
depends. I think podcasts are really hard in terms of growing an audience.
Yes.
And I've actually been surprised because I went into it with this big audience.
Yeah.
And even with 30,000 people who regularly read and open and love my newsletter, I still only really been able to get a couple thousand of them to listen to the podcast regularly. So again, it's just a totally different medium, but the upside of it has been that conversion piece, right? It really helps those people buy.